Well, let's discuss the current state of African business with Lubinda Habazoka, Director of the University of Zambia Graduate School of Business. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Now, first of all, I just want to pick you up actually on the Czech Foreign Minister's comments. He's started his 5-day trip to Angola and says that in the wake of the war in Ukraine, Europe needs to be more present in Africa. Do you think Europe is trying to increase its footprint in Africa again after this this situation with Ukraine?
Well, I think that Europe, especially the West at large, has been on a rapid mission to try to enhance their influence on Africa. It all started when they went sleeping and realized by 2010 that China had really gone into Africa. So we started seeing Europe and the USA coming more into Africa, but with very little to offer apart from political ideology and the sort of talk, transparency, promotion of transparency, development of democracy, but nothing on the hardware like infrastructure development. Mm-hmm. With the current conflict that is currently happening in the Ukraine issue, we have seen increased visits from the European Union and the United States of America into Africa, trying to stop or to reduce trade between Africa and Russia and China. Mm-hmm. We saw Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, coming to, for example, Zambia. Mm-hmm. We saw also the head of the IMF, the head of the World Bank, and looking at the fact that the IMF and the World Bank are multilateral institutions owned by all member states, it's quite surprising that you see, the Secretary, U.S. Secretary to the Treasury and the heads of these missions moving together, because they're supposed to be independent, but we've seen the increased also usage of other institutions to try to put pressure on African countries.
Indeed. What do you believe that the West and the US, what do you believe they fear from increasing cooperation between Africa and the likes of China and Russia, for example?
When you look at the way the world or the international financial architecture was crafted, from 1944-45, it was very clear that they wanted a world that was unipolar, a world controlled, by Bretton Woods institutions, a world where you could, impose sanctions on one country. I think that arithmetic was done, with the thinking that the USA and Western Europe was going to be dominant. But with the coming up of the, new powers, Russia after, the breakup of the Soviet Union also started coming out strong. China has also increased its network across the globe. I think, also Brazil, is also a major power now. They also have international interests, China, India, and the formation of BRICS just was the final nail into the coffin, because now you have like the alternative world whose GDP is over 45%. That is Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa, that are now living in a world that it is now becoming increasingly impossible to impose sanctions because we have alternative trade. So the idea, I think, is now to try to see how to contain what is currently prevailing.
Well, there's certainly a lot to unpack in that answer there, Lubinda. Obviously, you mentioned BRICS, whose GDP, I believe, is now slightly higher than the G7, and it's looking to expand. There's potentially Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and many other countries are looking to become part of this bloc. Where do you think Africa, obviously a continent of tremendous resources, where does it see itself as part of, well, South Africa and BRICS and Africa as a continent as a whole in the next 10, 20 years or so, as part of this multipolar world that appears to be forming?
Well, I think the lack of development in Africa has had everything to do with, having a unipolar world. Africa has been viewed as that continent where you need to just extract wealth, despite the fact that by the 1970s, most of the African countries had remained independent. When it came to economic sovereignty, that was not true. So Africa has constantly been used as just a source of, mineral resources. But with the African population getting educated, being able to understand the current dynamics, I think there's increasing cause for a multipolar world, a world that is not going to have a single currency dominance, a world where all the views are going to be heard. We used to have what was known as a non-allied movement, although with the with the finishing of the first Cold War, I would like to call it that, the first Cold War, we saw the non-aligned movement more like reduce its emphasis. But now we have been increasingly seeing, a lot of efforts coming from African countries that have that have been traditionally vision carriers of African economic sovereignty, pushing up and trying to, foster the multipolar world.
And sort of continuing on from that, we are seeing a certain level of de-dollarization as countries move to bilateral trade in their own currencies. Now, to what extent do you believe that sanctions imposed by the likes of America and the West have forced countries to sort of immunize themselves against these sanctions by getting rid of the dollar and trading just between themselves in their own currencies?
I think when you look at the dollar has been that weapon that has always been used to, suppress African views. And I think the current sanctions against Russia have come as a blessing in disguise to African countries, because we have been able to see that a country like Russia has been able to remain resilient and using the Chinese yuan and other currencies, the Indian rupee and, the dirham from the United Arab Emirates to do trade. When you look at, for example, a country like South Africa's major partners are its neighbors in Southern Africa, but to do trade, they need a dollar. So the South African rand is quite a stable currency, and more trade in local currencies will not only help boost the reserves for African countries that have to look for the dollar to do trade, but they don't actually do any meaningful trade with the United States of America. I think going forward, people are excited, and we hope to see a lot of improvements in economies of African countries.
Indeed. Now, I mentioned, obviously, I think my first question was, there's the West seeking to improve its relations with the African continent, but I think it's only fair to say that Russia is also playing a big role there. The Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has had about 3 or 4 trips just so far this year in Africa, quite big tours. Where do you see Russia's role with Zambia and the African continent as a whole?
First of all, I'd like to say that there's increasingly cause, we've seen that, where the West is trying to hinder the relationship between Russia and African countries. Yes, it's not too late. Russia is back on the continent. I think Russia started increasing its steps not only when the crisis came in, the Ukraine issue, but as early as 2010, 2011, we saw, even the Russian president then moving to various African countries. The foreign affairs minister has been everywhere, received, has been received very well in South Africa, in Kenya. We hope that he's going to come to Zambia one day. But what we have seen is that before he moves into any country, the West will send, envoys to that country and to neighboring countries. There's a lot of pressure to stop governments from receiving the foreign affairs minister, and countries that are vulnerable, especially with the current debt crisis that was escalated because of COVID. We've seen that African countries in some ways don't have enough leeway to even refuse such pressure.
Well, talking of difficulties receiving dignitaries, there's obviously the upcoming BRICS summit in South Africa in August, where there's that situation surrounding Vladimir Putin with the ICC arrest warrant out for him. If you were to speculate, how do you think that situation will resolve?
I think the South African issue has increased or basically verified our fears that there's a lot of pressure because we've seen also mixed answers. Today, the officials say this, tomorrow they say that. Of course, we've heard from the ruling party, the ANC in South Africa, that has said that President Putin is welcome, in South Africa. We saw what just recently happened when there was a foreign affairs meeting. They gave immunity to all the participants. South Africa is a country that is normally run. It's a more liberal country with power, decentralized. So. Like what happened with the former president of Sudan when he came in was also on the so-called wanted list by the not much respected ICC. We saw people going to court. I think to avoid this, South Africa is giving immunity, but you can clearly see with a lot of cause, by various, pressure groups to say South Africa should not receive the South African president. But when you look at generally the Russian president, but when you look generally into South Africa, the mood is quite clear. The ANC was supported by the Soviet Union. A lot of people that are in government in South Africa came through the Soviet Union system. You know, what really interests everybody in Africa, or it feels South Africa is a great power, and it's good that the pressure is going to South Africa, because it will act as that example to other smaller countries to say, you know, you can see you can withstand the pressure. The previous summit, parliamentary summit between Africa and Russia, we saw the main guest was the Speaker of the South African Parliament in Russia, and of course that is really causing a lot of worries in the European Union and in the West. But I think receiving President Putin in South Africa is going to be a very huge milestone for not only Africa to show that Africa is independent and Africa is ready to do trade without being told what to do.
Well, it was certainly interesting to see what happens come August. Now, returning a little bit now to the war in Ukraine, obviously the grain deal brokered by Turkey between Ukraine and Russia that allows the export of grain and fertilizers, and it was extended recently as well. How crucial has this been for the continent in helping, well, basically supply food? I know obviously these Horn of Africa's in particular difficulty at the moment.
Well, Africa, much of Africa is, especially on the southern part, is food sufficient. When you look at who are the major winners in the grain deal, 47% of the grain is going to Western Europe, Netherlands being the leaders. 25% I think is going to China and Turkey. Only about 27% is going to the least developed countries in Africa. So looking at African countries, yes, it's a very good deal, but the major winners remain Western countries, consuming 47% of what Ukraine produces. We hope to see more of such, and we hope to see a truce. But despite the fact that there's this grain deal, there should be no double standards, because on one side they are saying the grain deal should go on, but they are trying to literally stop African countries from buying fuel from Russia, stopping African countries to consume fertilizers from Russia. So if you want to enhance food security in Africa, there's the issue of fertilizer. People have to use sorts of different deals to buy Russian fertilizer. So if the United Nations, if Western partners really want to see food security in Africa, then they should allow free trade. The same way they are buying diesel from Russia, buying petrol, they are still buying fertilizer. There should not be any cap or any pressure for African countries not to buy those commodities from Russia.
Well, Lubinda Habazoka, the Director of the University of Zambia Graduate School of Business. We could continue discussing this for hours to come, but it was a pleasure to have you here on RT. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much.